It's not every day you see a woman in stilettos, stomping up to a farm gate like she's leading a federal raid, with a clipboard instead of a badge, and a hairstyle that screamed, "I don't belong here." She demanded entry, claiming inspection rights, as if HOA stood for Homeland Operations Authority. No warrant, no courtesy, just pure suburban delusion in full throttle. What followed felt like a crossover between a courtroom drama and a paltry documentary. I didn't know whether to offer her a cup of tea or a reality check. If you've ever had a neighbor who treated the HOA bylaws like sacred scripture, you're gonna feel seen. And if you haven't, well, keep watching. You'll understand why people like her get nicknames. Oh, and feel free to share your own HOA horror in the comments. Misery loves ridiculous company. It was a perfect Sunday morning in June. I was out watering my tomato plants, coffee mug in hand, enjoying the quiet sounds of country life. The morning mist was just lifting off the green grass, and my chickens were clucking contentedly in their coop. It was exactly the kind of peaceful moment I'd moved to the countryside to experience. Then I heard the screech of brakes and the aggressive honking of a car horn. I looked up to see an old red Honda Civic that had come to an abrupt stop right in front of my gate. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped a woman who looked completely out of place in this rural setting. She was wearing a navy blue business suit with a pencil skirt and 4-inch heels, carrying a clipboard like she was conducting some kind of official business. Her blonde hair was styled in what I can only describe as a soccer mom trying to look professional, and her makeup was heavy enough for a board meeting in downtown. "Open this gate now!" she shouted across the 15 feet between us, waving her clipboard in the air like some kind of authority badge. Her heels were already sinking into the soft dirt of my driveway, and I could see her struggling to maintain her balance. I set down my watering can and walked over calmly, still holding my coffee. "Good morning," I said with a friendly smile. "Can I help you with something?" "I'm HOA President Pamela Briggs," she announced, as if that title should strike fear into my heart. "I'm conducting a mandatory property inspection of your premises. You need to open this gate immediately so I can access your property and document violations." She spoke with the kind of authority that suggested she was used to people jumping when she gave orders. I could see her eyes darting around, already taking mental notes of things she considered problematic. "Ma'am, this is private property," I replied politely, gesturing to the clearly visible sign. "What specific concern brings you here on a Sunday morning?" "If there's an issue, I'd be happy to discuss it, but I'd need to see some documentation about your authority to inspect private land." I kept my tone respectful but firm. I've learned from years in tech that staying calm and asking for specifics usually reveals when someone doesn't actually have the authority they claim. Pamela's face flushed red, and her voice rose an octave. "People like you are ruining this neighborhood. You think you can just move out here and do whatever you want? I don't need documentation. I'm the HOA president." She stabbed her finger toward my property. "I can see violations from here, tall grass, unauthorized livestock, and probably noise violations too." I almost laughed. My grass was perfectly maintained. I'd mowed it just 3 days ago. The chickens were hardly unauthorized. They're completely legal in our county, and I'd checked the regulations before buying them. As for noise violations, the loudest thing on my property was probably the gentle bubbling of my small water feature. "Could you show me what rules you think I'm breaking?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "I'd like to document this conversation to make sure I understand your concerns correctly." The moment she saw me start recording, Pamela's demeanor shifted from authoritative to furious. "You can't record me without permission," she shrieked, though of course I was on my own property and had every right to document someone making accusations against me. "I'm going to report this harassment to the authorities." She began pacing back and forth by her car, her heels clicking against the pavement, muttering under her breath about property owners who don't know their place. I watched as she tried to peer through the slats of my white wooden fence, standing on her tiptoes and craning her neck to see into my backyard. It was almost comical watching someone in a business suit and stilettos trying to conduct surveillance on a farm. My chickens seemed curious about the noise and had wandered closer to the fence, clucking softly, as if they were commenting on the strange visitor. "Ma'am, if you have specific concerns about my property, I'm happy to discuss them," I said, maintaining my calm tone. "But I'll need to see written documentation of any violations and proof of your authority to demand access to private land." I could see this was not the response she'd expected. She was clearly used to intimidating people into compliance, and my polite but firm resistance was throwing off her whole approach. Pamela stomped back to her car, her heels making angry clicking sounds on the pavement. She yanked open the driver's door and turned back to glare at me. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she shouted across the distance. "I'll be back tomorrow with real authority. You'll regret the day you decided to challenge me." With that dramatic declaration, she climbed into her Honda, slammed the door, and peeled out with more tire squealing than necessary, leaving a small cloud of dust and the strong scent of burned rubber. I stood there for a moment, coffee still in hand, watching her car disappear down the country road. My peaceful Sunday morning had certainly taken an unexpected turn, but I had a feeling this was just the beginning. As I headed back to finish watering my tomatoes, I made a mental note to check my security cameras and maybe do some research on HOA authority limits. Something told me Pamela Briggs wasn't the type to give up easily. Monday morning arrived with the same peaceful beauty as the day before. I was enjoying my coffee on the front porch, watching my chickens pecking around the yard, when I heard the familiar sound of Pamela's Honda Civic coming down the road. This time, however, she wasn't alone in her mission. She'd clearly spent Sunday evening preparing for what she saw as round 2 of our confrontation. Pamela stepped out of her car wearing the same type of professional outfit, but today she carried a thick folder and had her phone ready for action. She marched up to my gate with renewed confidence, her heels clicking determinedly on the pavement. "I've spent considerable time researching your violations," she announced, waving her folder in the air. "I have official complaints ready to file with the county and state authorities." "Good morning to you too," I replied, walking over with my coffee. "What specific violations are you referring to?" I was genuinely curious to see what she'd come up with overnight. She opened her folder with dramatic flair and began reading from what appeared to be a typed list. Excessive grass height, illegal chickens, late-night noise, and, apparently, fence crimes, she said, like she was listing FBI charges. "I've documented everything with photographs and prepared formal complaints for submission to multiple agencies." I couldn't help but smile. "Ma'am, could you show me which agency gave you the authority to measure grass height on private property? Because I printed out the actual HOA rules last night, and they only cover fence color and height limits. Nothing about grass, chickens, or noise levels." I pulled out my phone and showed her the document I downloaded from our county's website. Pamela's confident expression faltered for just a moment before she doubled down. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm the HOA president, and I know what's allowed in this community." She attempted to lean over my 4-foot decorative gate to get a better look at my property, but her pencil skirt and high heels made this maneuver both awkward and unsuccessful. That's when my neighbor Frank Davidson chose the perfect moment to drive by in his pickup truck. Frank had lived in the area for 20 years and knew everyone's business. He pulled over and rolled down his window. "Everything okay here, Marshall?" he called out, his weathered face showing genuine concern. "Just discussing HOA rules with Ms. Briggs," I replied. Frank's expression immediately changed when he heard the name. He parked his truck and walked over, his work boots making solid contact with the ground, in sharp contrast to Pamela's precarious heels. "That's Pamela Briggs," Frank said to me in a voice loud enough for her to hear. "She's been terrorizing families in this area for 2 years. Drove the Johnson family right out of their home with constant harassment over their kid's swing set." He turned to address Pamela directly. "Lady, that's not how property rights work around here." I decided this was a good time to test my outdoor speaker system I'd installed for garden parties. I activated it with my phone, and soft country music began playing from speakers hidden among the landscaping. The gentle melody of classic American folk songs created a perfect contrast to the tension at my gate. Pamela's frustration was becoming more obvious by the minute. Her perfectly styled hair was starting to wilt in the morning humidity, and her makeup was beginning to show stress lines. "You people don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "I'm trying to maintain property values and community standards. This neighborhood is going downhill because residents don't respect the rules." "Which rules specifically?" I asked, holding up my phone with the official HOA guidelines displayed. "Because according to the actual regulations I downloaded, highlighted, bookmarked, and now laminated, HOA authority is limited to fence color and height. I run a tech farm, ma'am. Documentation is kind of my love language. My fence is white, which is approved, and it's exactly 4 feet high, which is within the limit." Frank chuckled and pointed to my property. "Marshall's got one of the nicest places in the county. Grass is perfect, chickens are legal, and it's quieter here than a library. What exactly is your problem with his property?" Pamela began frantically taking photos with her phone, trying to find anything that could support her claims. She walked back and forth along the fence line, her heels clicking on the pavement, searching for some violation she could document. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was standing directly next to my private property no trespassing sign while claiming the right to inspect my land. "I have the right to inspect this property," she declared, now sounding more desperate than authoritative. "I represent the community standards of this entire area. Her folder of official-looking documents was beginning to look less impressive, especially since Frank was clearly skeptical of her authority. "Show me that right in writing, please," I said calmly, still recording our conversation. "I'd like to see the legal document that gives HOA presidents the authority to inspect private property without consent or a warrant." Frank crossed his arms and shook his head. "Lady, I've lived here longer than you've been HOA president. That's not how any of this works. You can't just demand access to someone's private land because you feel like it." The morning breeze chose that moment to scatter some of Pamela's important papers from her folder. She scrambled to catch them, her heels making the task nearly impossible on the soft shoulder of the road. My chickens, attracted by the commotion, had wandered closer to the fence and were clucking softly, almost as if they were providing commentary on the ridiculous scene unfolding before them. Pamela straightened up, clutching her remaining papers, her face red with embarrassment and anger. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she said, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Both of you. But I'm not done here, not by a long shot." She marched back to her car with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much, given that her heels kept catching in the gravel. "Fine. Tomorrow I'm bringing county officials and police. You'll see what real authority looks like." She slammed her car door and drove off, leaving Frank and me standing by my gate with the peaceful sound of country music and contented chickens in the background. Frank shook his head and chuckled. "That woman's got more determination than sense. You better be ready for whatever she's planning next." Monday evening found me in my home office, doing what any tech-savvy property owner would do: research. I spent a couple of hours looking up property rights, HOA authority limits, and local ordinances. The information was pretty straightforward. Our HOA had very limited power, mostly covering fence appearance and basic aesthetic guidelines. Nothing about livestock, grass height, or property access. Around 8 o'clock, Frank came by with a 6-pack of beer and a wealth of local knowledge. We sat on my front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink above my green pastures. "She's done this to 3 other families that I know of," Frank told me, taking a swig from his bottle. "The Johnsons, like I mentioned, plus old Mrs. Patterson got fined $500 for having garden gnomes she claimed were inappropriate yard decoration." Garden gnomes? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She'd fined someone for garden gnomes? "That's not even the worst of it," Frank continued. "There was a young couple, barely lasted 6 months. She called their tomatoes a threat to the HOA's ecosystem. She claimed their vegetable garden was an unauthorized agricultural operation." I shook my head, feeling a growing sense of responsibility. "So she's been getting away with this because people don't know their rights, or don't want to fight back?" "Exactly," Frank nodded. "Most folks just want to live in peace. They don't realize that half the stuff she threatens them with isn't actually within her authority. But you seem different. You're not backing down." We talked strategy for a while. Frank suggested that if Pamela caused more drama, he'd record everything on his phone. "People need to see how crazy she gets," he said. "Maybe if there's video evidence, other folks will feel brave enough to speak up." The evening was peaceful, and Frank headed home around 10 o'clock. I did one final check of my security cameras. They covered all angles of my property and were motion activated. Everything looked normal as I got ready for bed, but at 11 o'clock sharp, my security system alert chimed on my phone. I checked the camera feed and saw Pamela's Honda Civic slowly driving past my gate. She had a flashlight and was shining it across my property from the road. I watched in disbelief as she got out, flashlight in hand, creeping along the edge of my fence like she was in a low-budget spy movie. Years ago, I might have just let it slide. I used to think dealing with HOA craziness was just part of life. But this time, I had my cameras, I had my records, and I had no intention of being pushed off my land by a woman in heels holding a flashlight like it was a weapon. The audio pickup from my security system was good enough to catch her voice as she muttered to herself. "Tomorrow I'll show him who's boss around here," she said, the flashlight beam dancing across my chicken coop and garden. "Nobody refuses Pamela Briggs and gets away with it." She spent about 10 minutes walking back and forth along my fence line, taking photos with her phone and making notes on a small pad. It was surreal watching someone conduct what could only be described as reconnaissance on my peaceful farm property. Finally, she got back in her car and drove away, but not before I'd recorded the entire incident. I called Frank immediately. "You're not going to believe this, but Pamela just spent 10 minutes doing surveillance on my property with a flashlight." "Are you serious?" Frank's voice was wide awake despite the late hour. "Please tell me you got that on camera. Every second of it, plus audio. She's clearly planning something for tomorrow." I forwarded the video file to Frank's phone. "What do you think she's up to?" Nothing good, Frank replied, but whatever she's planning, we'll be ready for it. I'm definitely coming over tomorrow morning. This has gone way beyond normal HOA business. After hanging up, I spent a few more minutes reviewing the security footage. Pamela's behavior was escalating from annoying to potentially problematic. The fact that she was conducting nighttime surveillance of my property suggested she was planning something more aggressive than just showing up with her clipboard and attitude. I made sure all my devices were charged, tested my camera functions, and organized the basic property rights information I'd printed earlier. Frank was right. Whatever Pamela had planned for tomorrow, we needed to be prepared to document everything. The irony wasn't lost on me that here I was, a tech worker who'd moved to the countryside for peace and quiet, now having to prepare for what felt like a suburban warfare scenario. But I'd learned long ago that bullies only stop when someone stands up to them, and it seemed like Pamela Briggs had been getting away with her intimidation tactics for far too long. As I finally settled down for the night, I could hear the gentle sounds of my farm, the soft clucking of chickens settling in for sleep, the quiet splash of ducks on the pond, and the whisper of wind through the grass. It was exactly the peaceful environment I'd worked so hard to create, and I wasn't about to let someone's power trip destroy it. At 7 o'clock sharp the next morning, I heard the now familiar sound of Pamela's Honda Civic pulling up to my gate, but this time, something was different. She was dressed like she meant serious business, carried a thick folder that looked official, and had the confidence of someone who'd spent all night preparing for battle. Whatever she'd planned during her midnight surveillance mission, it was about to unfold. Tuesday morning brought with it a performance that could have won Pamela an Academy Award for most dramatic overacting. She arrived at exactly 7 o'clock. Climbing out of her Honda Civic like she was stepping onto the set of a legal drama. Gone was yesterday's slightly disheveled appearance. She was now wearing a sharp black pantsuit, carrying a professional-looking briefcase, and holding a thick folder that screamed official business. "I've alerted the county, the state, and probably the FBI by now," she said, as if my tomato plants were an international threat. "Your property is in violation of multiple zoning ordinances and environmental regulations. I have documented evidence and signed affidavits from concerned community members." I walked over with my morning coffee, genuinely impressed by the effort she'd put into this performance. "Good morning, Pamela. That's quite a production you've put together. Could you show me which agency sent you the authority to file complaints on their behalf?" She opened her folder with theatrical precision and pulled out several typed documents that, from a distance, looked impressively official. "These are formal violation notices for unauthorized agricultural operations, improper livestock management, and failure to maintain property in accordance with community standards," she read in her most authoritative voice. "I'm curious," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the HOA guidelines I'd downloaded. "I printed the actual HOA rules last night. Could you point out which section gives you authority over agricultural operations or livestock management? Because according to this official county document, HOA jurisdiction is limited to fence color and height requirements." Pamela's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I don't need to justify my authority to you. These complaints have already been submitted to the proper agencies. You'll be hearing from official investigators very soon." That's when Frank arrived, right on schedule. His timing was perfect, as if he'd been watching from his own property and waiting for the show to begin. He parked his pickup truck and walked over, carrying his own coffee and wearing the kind of practical work clothes that made Pamela's power suit look even more ridiculous in this rural setting. "Morning, Marshall," Frank said with a nod. "Having another discussion about property rights with Miss Briggs?" The way he said her name made it clear that their previous encounters hadn't gone well for her. "She's presenting some very official-looking documents," I replied, gesturing toward Pamela's folder. "Claims she's filed complaints with county and state agencies about my property." Frank examined my yard with exaggerated thoroughness, stroking his chin like he was conducting a professional assessment. "Well, let's see. Grass looks perfect. Fence is regulation white paint and exactly 4 feet high. Chickens are contained in their proper area. What violations are we talking about?" Pamela's frustration was becoming more apparent as her audience grew. "You people don't understand the complexity of community regulations. I've been dealing with property management issues since before either of you moved to this area." "Actually," Frank said with a slight smile, "I've lived here for 20 years, and in all that time I've never seen anyone try to claim authority they don't actually have." He turned to me. "Marshall, you mind if I take some pictures of your property, just to document how well maintained everything is?" This suggestion seemed to panic Pamela. "You can't photograph my investigation. This is official HOA business." She clutched her folder closer to her chest, as if protecting state secrets. I activated my outdoor speaker system again, and the gentle sounds of country music began floating across the morning air. The contrast was perfect. Uptight woman in a business suit making dramatic claims about agricultural violations, while classic American folk songs played softly in the background. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "could you explain which specific agency gave you authority to conduct investigations of private property? I'd like to contact them directly to verify the complaints you filed." Pamela began pacing back and forth, her professional demeanor starting to crack under questioning. "I don't need to verify anything with you. I represent the property values and community standards of this entire neighborhood." Frank chuckled and shook his head. "Lady, property values around here are just fine. Marshall's place is one of the nicest in the county. Clean, well-maintained, peaceful. If anything, he's raising property values." That's when Pamela made her critical error. She began frantically taking photos with her phone, walking up and down my fence line, looking for anything at all that could support her claims. Her heels clicked frantically on the pavement as she searched desperately for evidence of violations that simply didn't exist. "I can document improper fence maintenance," she declared, photographing a section where some morning dew had collected on the white paint, "and unauthorized modifications to the original structure." She was pointing at the decorative scrollwork that had been part of the fence when I'd bought the property. "Ma'am," I said, holding up my phone with the property deed displayed, "that decorative work was installed by the previous owners 15 years ago. It's been approved by every HOA administration since then." Frank was now openly laughing. "And that's not improper maintenance, that's called morning dew. It happens when water vapor condenses on cool surfaces. Pretty normal around these parts." Pamela's official-looking documents were beginning to look less impressive under scrutiny. Several of the pages appeared to be templates she'd found online and filled in with my property information. The signatures looked suspiciously similar, and the agency letterheads were clearly not authentic. "Could you show me the contact information for these agencies?" I asked politely. "I'd like to call them directly to discuss these complaints." "You can't question my authority," Pamela snapped, her voice rising to a pitch that made my chickens look up from their morning pecking. "I'm the HOA president, and I know what's legal in this community." Frank crossed his arms and shook his head. "Actually, on his property, you don't have any authority at all. HOA rules don't override private property rights, and they sure don't give you the power to make up regulations that don't exist." The morning breeze chose that moment to scatter more papers from Pamela's folder. This time, instead of scrambling to collect them, she clutched the remaining documents tighter and glared at both of us with barely contained fury. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Both of you, standing there acting like you know better than someone who's been maintaining community standards for years." I maintained my calm tone. "We're not questioning your dedication to the community. We're just asking for documentation of the authority you're claiming to have." Pamela marched back toward her car, her professional composure completely abandoned. "Fine. You want to see real authority? I'm calling 911 right now. We'll see how smart you feel when officers drag you away in handcuffs." Frank and I exchanged glances. This had just escalated from annoying to potentially serious. Filing false police reports was illegal, but Pamela seemed desperate enough to try anything at this point. Watching Pamela dial 911 was like watching someone press the nuclear button over a garden hose. It wasn't just escalation, it was her final act of HOA desperation. I didn't even feel angry. Mostly I felt curious. How far would she go? Apparently all the way to felony territory. She stood by her Honda Civic, speaking loudly enough for Frank and me to hear every word of what could only be described as a creative interpretation of reality. "I need police assistance immediately," she said into her phone, her voice taking on a completely different tone, panicked, victimized, desperate. "I'm at 1527 County Road 42. A homeowner here is threatening me and blocking me from conducting official HOA business. I fear for my safety." Frank and I looked at each other with growing concern. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was a false police report, which carried serious legal consequences. I immediately started recording with my phone, making sure to capture both her statements and the peaceful reality of our situation. "He's been hostile and aggressive," Pamela continued, her voice getting more dramatic by the second. "I've been trying to conduct a routine property inspection as part of my official duties, and he's refused to cooperate. I'm concerned about potential violations that could affect community safety." The lies were coming so easily that I wondered if she actually believed them. Frank shook his head and pulled out his own phone, positioning himself to record from a different angle. "This woman's lost her mind," he muttered, but kept his voice low. After ending her call, Pamela's behavior became even more erratic. She was pacing like she was auditioning for HOA the musical. I watched her rehearse facial expressions and hand gestures like an actor preparing for an audition. "The officers will be here in 15 minutes, she announced, her voice now confident again. "We'll see how tough you are when you're explaining your behavior to law enforcement." I gathered my evidence folder, the HOA rules I'd printed, my property deed, and the security footage from her midnight surveillance mission. Frank positioned himself where he could film everything while staying out of the way. "Marshal," Frank said quietly, "she just lied to police about being threatened. That's a serious crime." "I know," I replied, making sure my phone was recording everything. "But we have video evidence of the truth. Let's just stay calm and let the facts speak for themselves." Pamela spent the waiting time trying to create evidence for her story. She attempted to move my private property sign, claiming it was blocking her access to conduct official business. When I politely asked her not to touch my property, she pointed at me dramatically. "That's harassment," she declared to no one in particular. "He's preventing me from doing my job." Frank couldn't help himself. "Lady, moving someone's sign without permission is destruction of property, and we've got it all on camera." Pamela dropped the sign and stepped back, looking frustrated that her attempt to create evidence had backfired. Her professional outfit was starting to show signs of stress. Sweat stains were appearing under her arms, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to wilt in the morning humidity. The 15-minute wait felt longer than it actually was. Pamela continued her nervous pacing, muttering under her breath about property owners who don't know their place and community standards going to hell. Meanwhile, my chickens had wandered over to investigate the commotion, clucking softly as they pecked around the fence line. "You know what's funny," Frank said, loud enough for Pamela to hear. "This is probably the most excitement this quiet road has seen in 20 years. Usually the biggest drama around here is when somebody's cow gets loose." I was testing my phone's recording function and checking the backup storage when I heard the distant sound of sirens. The moment of truth was approaching, and I felt a mixture of anxiety and confidence. I knew we had the facts on our side, but dealing with police is always unpredictable. "Here they come," Frank said, pointing down the road where 2 patrol cars were visible in the distance. "You ready for this?" "As ready as I can be," I replied, organizing my documentation one more time. "We've got video evidence, witness testimony, and all the relevant property laws. The truth should speak for itself." Pamela straightened her clothes and put on what I can only describe as a victim expression, practiced, pitiful, and completely artificial. She walked closer to the road, positioning herself to be the first person the officers would encounter. "Remember," she said, loud enough for us to hear, "I'm the one who called for help. I'm the victim here." Frank shook his head in disbelief. This woman's about to learn a very expensive lesson about filing false police reports. The sirens were getting louder, and I could see the patrol cars clearly now. 2 officers in separate vehicles, responding to what they believed was a situation involving threats and official business interference. I felt sorry for them. They had no idea they were about to walk into a completely fabricated drama. As the first patrol car pulled up, Pamela immediately approached with her hands slightly raised, as if she'd been cowering in fear. Her performance was beginning, and I had to admit, if I didn't know the truth, her act might have been convincing. The sound of car doors slamming shut signaled the beginning of what would either vindicate my position or create serious problems for me. Everything depended on the next few minutes, and whether the officers would take the time to examine the evidence before making assumptions. 2 patrol cars arrived simultaneously, their blue and red lights still flashing as they parked on the shoulder of County Road 42. The lead officer, a young man who looked to be in his late 20s, stepped out with the measured confidence of someone experienced in rural property disputes. His name tag read Thompson, and something about his calm assessment of the scene immediately made me feel more optimistic. Pamela rushed toward the officers before they'd even finished exiting their vehicles. "Thank God you're here," she exclaimed, her voice taking on a trembling quality that would have impressed Broadway directors. "I've been trapped here for hours. This man has been threatening me and preventing me from conducting official HOA business." Officer Thompson paused and looked around the scene. His gaze took in Frank standing calmly by his pickup truck, me holding a coffee mug and some papers, and Pamela in her business suit looking frantic and disheveled. The contrast couldn't have been more obvious. "Ma'am, slow down," Officer Thompson said, his voice professionally calm. "Tell me exactly what threats were made against you." This was the moment when Pamela's performance reached peak drama. She pointed at me with a shaking finger and declared, "He refused to let me inspect his property. When I told him I had official authority, he became hostile and aggressive. I feared for my safety." Officer Thompson's expression remained neutral, but I caught him glancing at Frank and me again. We were standing about 20 feet away, clearly not posing any kind of threat. Frank was casually leaning against his truck, and I was holding legal documents and a coffee mug, hardly the picture of dangerous criminals. "Sir," Officer Thompson addressed me directly, "what's your version of these events?" "Officer, I'd be happy to explain," I replied, walking closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I have video documentation of our entire interaction, plus relevant property laws and HOA regulations. This lady has been demanding access to my private property, claiming HOA authority she doesn't actually possess." Pamela immediately interjected, "He's lying. I have official complaints filed with multiple agencies." She waved her folder frantically. "I'm conducting legitimate inspections." Officer Thompson held up his hand to quiet both of us. "Let me see some identification from everyone, and then we'll sort this out step by step." As we all reached for our IDs, he spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, can you run a check on the caller named Pamela Briggs? Any prior calls involving this individual?" The response came back crackling through the radio within seconds. "Affirmative, Officer Thompson. We have multiple prior calls involving that name. Property disputes, harassment complaints, several other residents have filed reports." I watched Pamela's confident expression falter as Officer Thompson's demeanor shifted noticeably. He was no longer treating this as a simple he said, she said situation. "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said to Pamela, "could you show me documentation of your authority to inspect private property?" His tone had become more formal, more skeptical. Pamela fumbled with her folder, pulling out the typed documents she'd prepared. "I'm the HOA president. I have the right to ensure community compliance." Officer Thompson examined the papers briefly, then looked up at me. "Sir, do you have the actual HOA regulations?" I handed him my laminated HOA rulebook, complete with color-coded tabs and a QR code linking directly to the county's official website. "In case you want to check for yourself, officer," I said. "Unlike Pamela's documents, mine aren't written in Comic Sans." "Officer, HOA authority in this area is limited to fence appearance and height. Nothing about property inspections or agricultural operations." Frank stepped forward. "Officer, I've lived in this area for 20 years. This woman has been harassing multiple families with fake authority claims. She drove my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to sell her house over garden gnome violations that weren't actually violations." Officer Thompson was clearly putting the pieces together. He looked at Pamela's obviously fabricated documents, then at my legitimate property paperwork. "Ma'am, what specific threats did this gentleman make against you?" Amelia's story began to crumble under direct questioning. "Well, he refused to comply with my authority. He was recording me without permission. He made me feel unsafe." "Recording someone on your own property is completely legal," Officer Thompson stated matter-of-factly, "and asking for documentation of claim authority isn't threatening behavior." That's when I showed him the security footage from Pamela's midnight surveillance mission. "Officer, she was here last night at 11 o'clock, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance on my property with a flashlight." Officer Thompson reviewed the video on my phone, his expression growing more serious. "Ma'am, is this you conducting surveillance of this property at 11 p.m.? Pamela's performance was falling apart rapidly. "I was just checking for violations. It's my job to monitor community compliance. At 11 o'clock at night, without the property owner's knowledge?" Officer Thompson's tone had become distinctly unsympathetic. "Ma'am, that could be considered stalking or harassment." Frank couldn't resist adding, "Officer, she's been doing this to multiple families. We've all been too polite to call police, but she's gotten completely out of control." Officer Thompson turned back to Pamela with what I can only describe as professional disappointment. "Ma'am, filing false police reports is a felony. Claiming someone threatened you when they clearly did nothing wrong is a serious offense." Pamela's victim act completely collapsed. "False? I wasn't filing a false report. I genuinely felt threatened by his attitude. You felt threatened by a man standing on his own property, holding a coffee mug, asking for documentation?" Officer Thompson's skepticism was unmistakable. "Ma'am, that's not reasonable fear. That's someone not getting their way." The second officer, who had been quietly observing and taking notes, spoke up. "We've had several calls about HOA harassment in this area. Same pattern, fake authority claims, property access demands, threats about violations that don't exist." Officer Thompson nodded and addressed me directly. "Sir, you handled this situation appropriately. You stayed on your own property, asked for documentation, and recorded the interaction for your protection. That's exactly what I'd recommend to anyone in this situation." Pamela made one last desperate attempt to salvage her position. But the violations, the community standards, someone has to maintain property values. Ma'am, Officer Thompson said firmly, that someone is not you. HOA authority doesn't include property inspections without consent, and it certainly doesn't include filing false police reports when people don't submit to fake authority. Frank was grinning broadly now. Officer, this is the first time in 2 years anyone's called her out on this behavior. Maybe now the rest of us can live in peace. Officer Thompson looked directly at me. Sir, given the false report and pattern of harassment, would you like to press charges? This could end these problems permanently. The moment had arrived. Pamela stood there in her wrinkled business suit, all her fake authority stripped away, waiting to hear whether her bullying campaign was about to have serious legal consequences. The power dynamic had completely reversed, and justice was finally within reach. The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a campfire. Officer Thompson was offering me the chance to press charges against Pamela for filing a false police report, harassment, and potentially stalking. I looked at her standing there, her professional facade completely crumbled, mascara slightly smudged, and her confident demeanor replaced by genuine fear of legal consequences. Officer, I appreciate the offer, I said after considering my options carefully, but what I really want is for the harassment to stop. If she can agree to cease all contact with me and respect my property rights, I'd prefer to handle this without criminal charges. Officer Thompson nodded approvingly. That's generous of you, sir. However, given the pattern of behavior in the false report, this needs to be documented officially. He turned to Pamela with authority that brooked no argument. Ma'am, you're receiving an official warning for filing a false police report and harassment. Any future incidents involving false claims or property harassment will result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. Pamela's voice was barely above a whisper. I understand, officer. I was just trying to maintain community standards. I never meant for things to go this far. Ma'am, the second officer interjected, community standards don't override property rights and civil laws. What you've been doing isn't community leadership, it's harassment. Frank stepped forward, unable to contain his satisfaction. Officer, speaking for the neighborhood, we really appreciate you taking this seriously. She's been terrorizing families for 2 years. Officer Thompson completed his report while explaining the legal implications to Pamela. Any future false reports to law enforcement will result in felony charges. Trespassing on private property or continuing harassment will lead to restraining orders and criminal prosecution. Do you understand these consequences? Pamela nodded weakly, clutching her folder of fake documents. Yes, officer, I understand. As the police officers prepared to leave, Officer Thompson handed me his card. Sir, if she contacts you again or causes any further problems, call us immediately. Don't hesitate to press charges if this behavior continues. After the patrol cars disappeared down County Road 42, an awkward silence settled over the scene. Pamela stood by her Honda Civic, looking like she was trying to figure out how her morning of planned triumph had turned into complete humiliation. I was just trying to protect property values, she said quietly, more to herself than to Frank or me. Frank shook his head. Lady, the best way to protect property values is to mind your own business and let people enjoy their homes in peace. Pamela climbed into her car without another word, started the engine, and drove away. Slowly this time, no dramatic tire squealing or clouds of dust, just the quiet retreat of someone whose bluff had been called and found completely empty. Frank and I stood by my gate, listening to the peaceful sounds of country life returning to normal. My chickens had resumed their morning routine, clucking contentedly as they searched for bugs in the grass. The outdoor speaker system was still playing soft country music, creating a soundtrack for what felt like a victory celebration. Well, Frank said with a broad grin, I'd say that went better than expected. Much better, I agreed. Thanks for being here, Frank. Having a witness made all the difference. Couldn't let you face down the neighborhood tyrant alone, he replied. Besides, it was about time someone stood up to her nonsense. Within hours, word of the morning's events spread through our small community. Frank made sure to tell his wife, who told her sister, who mentioned it at the grocery store. By evening, I had received supportive phone calls from 3 families who shared their own stories about Pamela's harassment campaigns. Mrs. Patterson called. I moved out over garden gnomes, she said. Thanks for proving she was just another wannabe dictator with a clipboard. I wish I'd known then what you proved today, that she had no real authority. The Johnson family, who'd been forced to remove their children's swing set, stopped by in person. We actually considered moving because of her harassment, Mr. Johnson told me. It's good to know someone finally stood up to her. 1 week later, a for sale sign appeared in Pamela's front yard. Frank knocked on my door that evening to share the news. Looks like she's decided to find a new neighborhood to terrorize, he said with satisfaction. Think she learned her lesson? I asked. Probably not, Frank replied honestly. But at least she'll be someone else's problem now. 2 weeks after the police incident, I received an official letter from the HOA board apologizing for Pamela's behavior and clarifying the actual scope of HOA authority. The new board president, elected in an emergency meeting after Pamela's resignation, assured all residents that property inspections would only occur with proper legal authority and owner consent. My peaceful farm life returned to its intended rhythm. I spent my mornings watering tomatoes and feeding chickens, my afternoons working on tech projects for my home office, and my evenings enjoying the sunset over 15 acres of green pasture. The private property no trespassing sign remained exactly where I had installed it, and no one questioned my right to maintain it. Frank and I became closer friends through the experience, bonding over our shared victory against neighborhood tyranny. We'd occasionally see each other in the morning and joke about the great HOA war of County Road 42. The story became local legend. Other communities in the area began calling me for advice when they faced similar HOA harassment situations. I always gave the same counsel: know your rights, document everything, stay calm, and don't be afraid to call authorities when someone exceeds their actual authority. And that's how an HOA president thought she could bully a tech guy who just wanted to enjoy his chickens and tomatoes in peace. But maybe she forgot that people who work with technology also understand the power of documentation and evidence. My 15 acres are more peaceful than ever, and the community learned a valuable lesson about the difference between real authority and imagined power. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is simply to let them reveal their true nature to the people who have real authority to stop them. In this case, the truth was all the weapon we needed.